Think about the last time you did something that wasn't in some way a performance. Not something big, just any moment at all. A conversation where you weren't watching yourself from a slight distance, a decision that had no audience, even an imaginary one, a version of yourself that nobody needed you to be. Most of us are struggling to remember when that was. We've been in the role so long. The competent one, the reliable one, the person with the right opinions and the appropriate reaction to everything, that a question has started forming somewhere underneath it all. One we don't ask out loud because we're not sure we want the answer. There's a film built around that question. Released in 1999, buried by almost everything else that came out that year, it remains one of the strangest and most quietly devastating things David Cronenberg ever made. Tonight, we're watching eXistenZ. The film opens in a church, not a real one, a repurposed one, converted into a seminar space with pews full of eager people waiting for something to be revealed. On the stage, a woman named Allegra Geller is demonstrating her new game, and the crowd watches her the way people watch someone they've decided is a prophet. The game carries the same name as the film, eXistenZ, small e, capital X, capital Z. It runs on an organic device called a GamePod, which looks less like technology and more like a living thing, fleshy and soft, pulsing faintly in the hand. Players connect to it through a cord resembling an umbilical cable, which plugs into a socket in the spine called a bioport, and once that connection is made, there's no screen to look at. You simply are in the game, inside a world that looks and feels exactly like the real one. And then someone in the audience stands up and shoots Allegra with a gun built from human bones that fires human teeth as ammunition. That's your entry point. From there, Allegra runs with a reluctant young PR man named Ted Picoul, played by Jude Law, a man who has never had a bioport and has never played a game, and is about to have both of those things change whether he wants them to or not. Jennifer Jason Leigh plays Allegra, and her performance is unusual from the first scene. She isn't warm, and she isn't frightened the way you'd expect a person to be frightened. She's focused, because her game pod has been damaged, and that matters to her more than almost anything else. The pod holds the only existing copy of eXistenZ, and she needs someone to plug in with her and help her test whether it's still intact. She needs Ted. What follows is a thriller in the loosest possible sense, with assassins and factions and corporate espionage and double-crossing. But none of that is what the film is actually about. The thriller elements are a delivery mechanism. What Cronenberg is really doing sits underneath all of it, and it takes most of the running time to see it clearly. The mood throughout is deliberately flat. The world between game sessions is oddly bland, the acting slightly stilted, the locations generic. A gas station appears whose sign reads simply "Country Gas Station," as if whoever designed this world ran out of imagination for the small details. Critics at the time called this a flaw, and they were wrong. It's the whole point, and we'll arrive there shortly. The first time Ted and Allegra plug into eXistenZ together, there's no fanfare, no dissolve, no glowing digital corridor, no dramatic signal of any kind. One moment they're lying on a bed with the pod humming between them, and the next they're standing in a trout farm, fully clothed, speaking dialogue that feels slightly wrong, a little too scripted, as if their mouths are moving just ahead of whatever part of them would normally approve the words. That is one of the most specific things this film gets right about an experience we now recognize very well, being inside a system that generates your behavior for you. You're the one speaking. You're the one making the decisions. But something else runs underneath, and every so often you catch yourself mid-sentence with the thought that you didn't actually choose to say that. Ted finds this alarming. He keeps wanting to stop and confirm whether they're still in the game, distracted by the familiar texture of a world that is almost real, and troubled by the moments when he acts in ways he hadn't planned. Allegra finds it far less troubling, because she designed this world and understands that the compulsion to act, to speak, to follow the game's internal logic, that isn't a malfunction, that's the product. A scene in a Chinese restaurant inside the game captures this perfectly. Ted finds himself assembling a gun from the bones and gristle left on his plate, his hands moving without a decision behind them, and when the weapon sits finished in front of him, he stares at it with a kind of horrified fascination. He picked up a piece of the world and it became something dangerous, without him planning to be the kind of person who would do that. The game decided, and his hands obeyed. Cronenberg has said the game was never really about video games. It was about cinema, and about any immersive system that asks you to suspend your judgment and follow the logic of the world you've been placed inside. A cinema audience does this. Someone scrolling a feed does this. An employee performing the version of themselves their workplace requires does this every single day. The game is every container we step into that quietly reshapes who we are while we're inside it. And the film knows that most of us have been inside one for longer than we'd like to admit. Part of what makes this film easier to inhabit than people expect is Ted, who is not cool and not heroic in any meaningful sense. He's a PR trainee who gets assigned to protect a person he can barely keep up with, in a situation he fundamentally doesn't understand. spending most of the film being afraid and confused and slightly annoyed at everything happening to him. A bioport is something he's never wanted in his body. The game is something he's never wanted to enter. The feeling of his hands moving without permission, of his own mouth producing words he didn't choose, all of it disturbs him in a way he can't quite argue himself out of. Jude Law plays him with a particular exasperated decency that makes Ted one of the more underrated performances of his early career. Intelligent enough to understand what's happening, and uncomfortable enough with it to keep asking the questions the film needs asked, Ted functions as the most honest surrogate the movie could offer, which is to say, he functions as us. Allegra is the artist and the true believer, the person for whom the game is the only thing that matters. Ted is the person who got pulled in and can't decide whether to commit, and Cronenberg is wise enough to keep him in that position for nearly the entire film. He never fully surrenders. He never stops asking where the line falls. He assembles the gristle gun, points it at the waiter, and feels sick about it afterwards, which matters more than it might seem. The film's most honest moment isn't Allegra's cool certainty. It lives in Ted's question, which surfaces in various forms throughout the story, and which is really one question wearing different clothes at different points. At what point does playing the game make you someone different from the person who sat down to play? There's no answer to that, but asking it, and refusing to stop asking even when Allegra tells him to relax and stop fighting, that's where the film's actual tenderness lives. And Cronenberg knows this, which is why the last act's most devastating revelation belongs to Ted, and why it lands the way it does. Before going further, it's worth talking about what this film actually looks like, because some preparation helps. eXistenZ is a body horror film, though not in the way most people expect. There's very little blood, and almost no violence for its own sake. The horror is quieter than that, rooted in the way the technology in this world is biological. Game pods are living objects, fleshy and warm, shaped somewhere between a kidney and a creature, and they pulse in the hand, can fall ill, and can die. Allegra carries hers the way you carry something fragile that might also, in some sense, love you back. The connection cable is called an umbicord for the obvious reason, and the socket it plugs into, the bioport, drilled directly into the base of the spine, is a surgical modification that most people in this world have accepted as routine, the way you might accept having your ears pierced. Ted is one of the holdouts, someone who has long resisted having his body altered to accommodate a machine, and who feels a physical revulsion at the idea that's more than just squeamishness. And so he ends up at a man named Gas, played by Willem Dafoe, with a wide, slightly unhinged warmth that makes the scene simultaneously funny and deeply unsettling. Gas runs a country gas station and installs black market bioports out of the back room, and he explains cheerfully that the installation gun arrives preloaded with an epidural. Just like when you have a baby, he says, and then he makes a hole in Ted's spine. What Cronenberg is doing with all of this isn't shock for its own sake. He's making an argument with biology rather than dialogue. The pods grow from fertilized amphibian eggs stuffed with synthetic DNA, built into devices that run on the body's own electrical current, compatible with us, even symbiotic, but not us. And the line between those two states, once crossed, turns out to be very difficult to locate again. The body horror operates as a metaphor in the most direct way possible. We already carry phones like extensions of ourselves, already feel phantom vibrations when nothing is there, already experience something close to grief when a device fails unexpectedly. Cronenberg simply made that relationship visible, gave it flesh, gave it a socket, and asked what it feels like to look at directly. Most people look away. The film rewards the ones who don't. There's a detail about this film's origin that changes the way you watch it, and almost no one brings it up when discussing eXistenZ. Cronenberg didn't get the idea from a video game. He got it from Salman Rushdie. In 1995, a Canadian magazine sent Cronenberg to London to interview Rushdie, who had spent 6 years in hiding by that point. The Iranian government had placed a death sentence on him, a fatwa, for writing a novel, not for committing any crime, but for making something that certain people decided had deformed their reality. Cronenberg sat with Rushdie, and they talked about games and whether games could be considered art. But what stayed with him was the situation itself, a man whose imagination had put him on a hit list, whose created world had been received as an act of violence against the real one. And Cronenberg left that conversation thinking about what would happen if the same thing befell a game designer. That question became eXistenZ, and it transforms every scene where the realists call Allegra a demoness, every moment where someone stands ready to kill her for making something immersive and absorbing. None of that is science fiction paranoia. That is a real argument, running between real people, about whether certain kinds of art should be permitted to exist at all. The argument hasn't gone away. We still have it about video games, and whether they cause violence, about social media, and whether it destroys the capacity for attention, about artificial intelligence, and whether it erodes something in human experience that can't be recovered. The realists in the film aren't wrong that something is being changed, they're just wrong about what to do with that knowledge. Allegra's response to being hunted is not to stop. She plays the game, goes deeper in, insists that what she made has value even when she can't demonstrate that value in terms her enemies will accept. There's something quietly admirable in that position, and the film lets you feel it without underlining it. One line in this film gets walked past by most viewers without a second thought, and it happens to be the line that makes everything else legible. It comes from inside the game. Ted has just said something he didn't intend to say, something his character was scripted to produce, and he's rattled by it. He tells Allegra it wasn't him, that his character said it, that he didn't mean it. And Allegra looks at him and says, without urgency or apology, there are things that have to be said to advance the plot and establish the characters, and those things get said whether you want to say them or not. Don't fight it. She's describing the game, but she's also describing every job you've held, every relationship with its established dynamic, every social setting with its unspoken script, every moment where you said the expected thing rather than the true thing, because the situation required it, and you didn't have the energy or the standing to push back. The advice isn't villainous. That's what makes it terrible. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like something a sensible person would say, and the fact that most of us have already taken it is the thing the film sits with quietly for 90 minutes. Later in the game, Ted asks whether free will exists in this world at all, and Allegra tells him there's just enough to make it interesting. Sitting with that answer for a while, it becomes harder to argue it's wrong. Not about the game, and not about the office, and not about the version of yourself you put on every morning before leaving the house. Cronenberg wrote all of this before social media existed, before the algorithm, before anyone had developed a vocabulary for the way platforms build incentive structures that gradually narrow what you say and who you are in public, until the narrowed version begins to feel like the original. He was watching people play games in 1995, and he saw where it was going. Released just weeks after eXistenZ in the spring of 1999, The Matrix was enormous, kinetic, visually revolutionary, built around a clear hero and a clear enemy and a clear answer to its central question. Reality is out there, and you just have to fight your way to it. eXistenZ offers no such comfort. Its answer to the same question runs closer to, maybe there's no out there, maybe the game you're in goes all the way down, maybe the realists fighting to preserve authentic experience are themselves playing a role inside someone else's game. The timing of the two releases buried Cronenberg's film. It looked modest and unflashy next to the Wachowskis' vision, and it earned less than $3 million in its theatrical run. What's strange is that this absence of an exit isn't depressing to sit with. A film that refuses to offer you a way out leaves only one thing to work with: what you do inside the layer you're already in. The relationships you choose, the resistance you commit to, the moments when you press your hands against the wall, not because you expect to find a seam, but because being the kind of person who checks still means something. The Matrix handed you a red pill. eXistenZ tells you there might not be a pill, but insists that the act of asking, the refusal to simply accept the world as it was handed to you, carries its own kind of freedom. And in 2026, when layers of performance and platform and persona have stacked up higher than most of us can easily count, that argument feels less like science fiction and more like a description of the week you just had. The film ends with a man pointing a gun and a question. Ted and Allegra, now revealed as realists, have just killed the real game designer, the one whose game all of them were actually inside. The other players stand around in shock, and a small frightened man who has been a background presence throughout the story steps forward and asks the only question left. Are we still in the game? Nobody answers. The credits roll. Cronenberg has said he doesn't think the question needs an answer, and he's right, not simply because the film is built around philosophical uncertainty, and not because it's a trick ending designed to generate discussion. The question stays with you because it's the question you arrived with, the one that was already running before the title appeared on screen. Not about the film. About your week, about the version of yourself you performed at work, about the opinions you expressed online that you're not entirely sure you believe, about the role you play in your family and your friendships and your relationship, about the mask that fits well enough that you've stopped noticing the weight of it. The film doesn't answer because it knows you already know. It just wanted you to stop long enough to ask. Watching eXistenZ tonight, you don't need to track the layers or keep score of which world is real, because that isn't the experience Cronenberg was building toward, and it isn't the experience you'll have. What you'll have instead is something quieter and stranger. A film that puts you inside a feeling you already carry, that slightly uncanny sense that the life you're performing and the life you're actually living have drifted a little apart, and sits with you in that feeling for 90 minutes without trying to resolve it or reassure you. Jennifer Jason Leigh's performance rewards the surrender completely. Once you stop resisting the flatness and let it wash over you, she becomes one of the great screen presences of the late 90s. Someone who inhabits ambiguity without announcing it, who might be the villain or the artist or the revolutionary or all three simultaneously, and who carries every layer of the film's uncertainty in the careful, deliberate way she moves through every space she enters. She insisted on keeping one of the prop pods with her between takes, to strengthen what you can feel on screen, a maternal bond with an object made of fake flesh that the film treats as entirely serious because it is. The organic technology holds up in ways that purely digital imagery rarely does, because flesh doesn't date. The game pods breathe and get sick, and respond to damage the way living things respond to damage, and the body horror is never there for its own sake. It's always making the argument that this is already inside you, that the boundary between the tool and the person using it dissolved long before anyone noticed. Watch it tonight, and then sit with the last question for a while. You'll know what it's asking. And tell me in the comments, is there a layer of your own life you've been testing at the edges lately? A version of yourself that feels a little constructed? I want to know what that looks like for you, because I think that's what this film is really about, and I think it's different for everyone who watches it.